In 1941, the United States faced a nightmare of arithmetic. Every day, German U-boats were sinking Allied ships faster than they could be built. A single cargo ship took 230 days to complete, nearly 8 months of labor, steel, and sweat. And every one that slipped beneath the waves carried not just supplies, but the lifeline of democracy itself. Then came a man who wasn't a naval officer, not a general, not even a sailor, just a civilian shipbuilder named Henry J. Kaiser. He had never built an ocean-going ship in his life. But he made a claim so outrageous that even his allies laughed. Kaiser said he could build cargo ships 50 times faster, not in months, but in days. The Navy scoffed. Politicians smirked. And yet, within 2 years, Henry Kaiser's shipyards were launching a brand new Liberty ship every 4 days. This is the forgotten story of how one man, armed with nothing but imagination and nerve, rewrote the rules of industrial warfare, and how his impossible idea helped save the Allies from disaster. The American home front in early 1941 was a place of uneasy transformation. The factories were awake again after the long, gray slump of the Depression, but the nation was still not at war. Europe was burning, Britain standing alone, bombed nightly, her merchant ships torn apart by German submarines. President Roosevelt's voice crackled over the radio, promising that America would be the arsenal of democracy. But behind the rhetoric lay a grim reality: you can't supply an army without ships. Every bullet, every tank, every sack of wheat bound for England had to cross the Atlantic, and those convoys were dying faster than they could be borne. The U.S. Maritime Commission calculated that to keep Britain alive, America would need to build thousands of cargo vessels. Yet the shipyards were too slow, too traditional, too few. Shipbuilding in 1940 was still a craft, an art of wooden scaffolds, riveted plates, and slow, methodical assembly. The great steel hulls were built piece by piece, like cathedrals. A single ship could take 200, even 300 days. By the time it was launched, the sea might already have swallowed its twin. Then came a man whose resume read like it had been dropped from another planet. Henry Kaiser had built dams, not ships, vast concrete monuments that reshaped the American West: Hoover, Bonneville, Grand Coulee. He was part engineer, part showman, part gambler. Where others saw logistics, he saw choreography. When the Maritime Commission invited him to tour the shipyards, he didn't see progress, he saw waste. Workers waited for parts. Welders stood idle while hulls were riveted. He turned to an official and said something that would echo across the war: "You're not building ships. You're building them one at a time." Kaiser had no formal engineering degree. What he had was audacity. He proposed an assembly line approach to shipbuilding, the same philosophy that made Detroit the motor capital of the world. If you could build a car in hours, why not a ship in days? Instead of starting at the keel and working slowly upward, he envisioned modular construction, prefabricating giant sections of the hull separately, then welding them together like puzzle pieces. It was radical. It was untested. And to the old shipwrights, it was heresy. The Maritime Commission hesitated. The Navy dismissed him outright. "Shipbuilding isn't like cars," one admiral told him. "You can't just bolt together a battleship." But Kaiser wasn't building battleships. He was building cargo carriers, simple, rugged, expendable vessels meant to carry beans, bullets, and hope across an ocean of danger. He needed only one thing: permission to try. When Britain placed an emergency order for ships in 1941, Kaiser got his chance. The British government, desperate and short on time, agreed to fund his experiment. He broke ground on a new shipyard in Richmond, California, a muddy patch of shoreline on the San Francisco Bay that would soon hum like a living organism. He hired not shipwrights but ordinary Americans, men and women who had never seen the sea. He trained them fast, drilled them harder, and introduced the most important innovation in the history of shipbuilding: welding instead of riveting. Traditional shipbuilding was slow because every steel plate had to be riveted by hand, thousands of red-hot bolts hammered into place by teams working in unison. Welding changed everything. Instead of pounding rivets, welders fused steel plates directly, cutting build times by weeks. It wasn't perfect. The early Liberty ships would later crack in cold seas, but it was fast, and speed was the only currency that mattered. Within months, the Richmond Yard became a city of its own. Floodlights turned night into day. Conveyor belts snaked between hulls. Cafeterias ran 24 hours. And in the center of it all, Kaiser moved like a conductor before an orchestra, orchestrating chaos into rhythm. He walked the docks in a hard hat and tie, scribbling notes, asking questions, shouting encouragement. Reporters who visited wrote that his shipyard felt more like a circus than an industrial plant, frantic, noisy, electric. By the time America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, Kaiser's experiment was no longer a curiosity, it was a necessity. The U-boats were winning, the Atlantic was bleeding ships, and the only answer was to build faster than the enemy could sink. Washington, skeptical at first, now turned to the man they once mocked. "Can you do for the nation," they asked, "what you did for the British?" Kaiser smiled. "Give me the steel," he said, "and I'll give you ships." And he meant it. When America plunged into war after Pearl Harbor, the country found itself in a race it had never trained for. The U-boats were tearing through Allied convoys in the Atlantic, sinking a ship every 7 hours. It was industrial warfare at sea, one side could destroy faster than the other could build. But in the shipyards of the West Coast, a quiet revolution was about to turn that equation upside down. Henry Kaiser's shipyards were unlike anything the U.S. Navy had ever seen. They were not cathedrals of craftsmanship but factories of speed. To the old guard, they looked like chaos, cranes swinging over half-built hulls, sparks flying in clouds of smoke, thousands of workers moving like ants through steel forests. But to Kaiser, it was beautiful. Every motion, every clang of a hammer, every roar of a welder's torch was part of a greater rhythm, a ship being born faster than logic should allow. The vessel at the heart of this miracle was the Liberty ship. Officially designated the EC-2 SC-1, it was simple, almost crude, 441 feet long, powered by a triple-expansion steam engine that could barely manage 11 knots. But its simplicity was its genius. The design was British, adapted from a pre-war cargo ship model. Kaiser didn't need sleek lines or cutting-edge technology. He needed something that could be mass-produced like a Model T. So he stripped shipbuilding down to its essence. Every Liberty ship was built from prefabricated sections, bow, stern, deckhouses, bulkheads, all assembled separately, then welded together like a massive metal puzzle. The parts were made in parallel, not in sequence. While one crew welded the bow, another assembled the deck, and another worked on the stern. It was a symphony of simultaneous labor. To keep the tempo, Kaiser borrowed methods from Detroit. He brought in foremen from automobile plants, men who thought in units per day, not months per hull. He divided the workforce into teams that specialized in single tasks, welding seams, fitting propellers, sealing decks, each trained for speed and repetition. It was Ford's assembly line, transposed to the waterfront. And then came the workforce itself, the beating heart of the miracle. By 1942, more than 90,000 people worked at Kaiser's Richmond yards. They were not traditional shipbuilders. They were housewives, farmhands, teachers, clerks, Americans who had never touched a welding torch in their lives. Kaiser didn't see that as a weakness. He saw it as a clean slate. "We don't need experience," he said. "We'll teach them." He opened training centers on site and in nearby towns, teaching welding, riveting, drafting, and safety. He created childcare centers so mothers could work shifts. He built hospitals and cafeterias, and even introduced something unheard of in American industry, free healthcare for employees. For many workers, the Kaiser shipyards weren't just a job. They were a chance at dignity, at purpose, at being part of something larger than themselves. The scale was staggering. The Richmond yard stretched for miles along the bay. At night, the glow of welding arcs lit the fog like lightning. Sirens wailed as shifts changed around the clock. Cafeterias served thousands of meals an hour. Liberty ships rose from the mud like steel mountains. To the workers, each ship was more than metal, it was a victory waiting to happen, a way to bring soldiers home, to send food and fuel to Europe, to keep the Allies alive. And the ships began to roll out, at first slowly, then faster. Where it once took 230 days to build a cargo ship, Kaiser's workers managed it in 70. Then 50. Then 30. Newspapers could hardly believe the numbers. The New York Times called it the new miracle of mass production. Reporters began timing launches like sporting events, counting the days between keel laying and christening. But Kaiser wasn't done. He had promised the impossible, and he meant to deliver it. In 1942, he announced a competition between his shipyards, to see which one could build a Liberty ship the fastest. At the Richmond Yard No. 2, crews worked day and night on the Robert E. Peary. They didn't sleep. They didn't slow. Meals were brought to them on carts. Parts arrived on conveyor belts like ammunition. Welders passed torches like batons in a relay. The noise never stopped. And then, in an achievement that defied reason, the Robert E. Peary slid into the water just 4 days and 15 hours after her keel was laid. From raw steel to sea-ready vessel in less than a week. Even Kaiser admitted it was partly a stunt. The ship was finished later with fittings and tests, but the message was clear, the impossible was now routine. Across the Atlantic, German intelligence officers refused to believe the reports. Their estimates said it was logistically impossible. One analyst supposedly wrote that, no nation could produce ships faster than they can be sunk. But they were wrong. The Liberty ships came faster than the U-boats could kill them. By the end of 1943, American shipyards, powered by Kaiser's philosophy, were launching a new Liberty ship every 4 days on average. Hulls were rolling off the ways like bullets from a machine gun. And for every ship that sank in the Atlantic, 2 more seemed to appear on the horizon. On the docks of Richmond, workers cheered as each one slid into the bay, champagne bottles bursting, bands playing, names painted fresh on gray steel. For many, it wasn't just about winning the war, it was about proving something deeper. That ingenuity, speed, and ordinary people, united under pressure, could outthink and outbuild tyranny itself. By 1943, Henry Kaiser's shipyards had become the beating heart of America's industrial war machine. From the skies above, the Richmond waterfront glowed like a small city, endless rows of steel skeletons, cranes arching over them like iron giants, searchlights cutting through the fog. Trains clattered in, unloading steel plate, welding rods, and engines, trucks rolled out with completed sections ready for assembly. It was not just a shipyard anymore. It was a world unto itself. Every 24 hours, thousands of workers streamed through the gates. Some came from small towns in the Midwest, others from the farms of Texas or the fields of Oklahoma. They were drawn by the same promise, steady pay, steady purpose, and a chance to do something that mattered. Richmond had once been a quiet port town, now it was bursting at the seams. Streets filled with barracks, diners, and taverns. Trains ran through the night to bring in workers for the next shift. Entire neighborhoods were built from scratch, Kaiser's version of a wartime utopia, where labor met mission. The workforce was unlike anything seen before. Men and women, black and white, skilled and unskilled, all worked side by side. For many, it was their first time doing so. In a country still divided by segregation, the shipyards became one of the first great melting pots of American labor. Posters on the walls read, "We're all in the same boat, build it strong." The heart of the yard was the welding floor. There, the noise never stopped, the crackle of arcs, the hiss of molten steel, the clang of hull plates sliding into place. The smell of oil and metal hung thick in the air. Workers wore heavy leather aprons and goggles that glowed blue in the light. Sparks rained down like fireflies. Every shift felt like a battle in its own right, a fight against time, fatigue, and the unrelenting demand for speed. Kaiser knew that morale was the invisible ingredient of efficiency. He walked the yards constantly, shaking hands, listening to complaints, cracking jokes. He treated welders like engineers and engineers like soldiers. He even held competitions for crews to see who could weld the cleanest seam or finish a section first. "You're not just building ships," he told them. "You're building victory." But beneath the pride lay exhaustion. The pace was relentless. Workers toiled 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. Some slept in cars between turns. Women who had never worked outside the home now handled torches and cranes with precision, their faces streaked with sweat and soot. Many were mothers. Kaiser built on-site nurseries where children played under watchful attendance while their parents welded a fleet. The concept was revolutionary, decades ahead of its time. In one corner of the yard stood a small hospital, the Permanente Health Plan, the first version of what would later become Kaiser Permanente. It offered free medical care to employees and their families, covering everything from burns to fatigue. Doctors and nurses patched up workers and sent them back to the line. "Take care of the people," Kaiser said, "and the work will take care of itself." It was an ethic that made his shipyards not just productive but deeply human. And the results were staggering. By late 1943, the Richmond shipyards alone had launched nearly 200 ships. At their peak, they could launch 3 in a single day. The workers gave each ship a soul. They named them after presidents, poets, farmers, even their own families. When a ship slid down the greased ways into the bay, the ceremony was electric. Sirens wailed. Bands played. Thousands gathered, cheering as the hull kissed the water for the first time. Women who had built the ship often christened it with bottles of champagne, their hands trembling with pride. There was the Jeremiah O'Brien, the John W. Brown, the Joseph N. Teal, ships that would later cross the Atlantic under fire, carrying food, tanks, and ammunition to soldiers waiting in England. Some would never return. Others would make dozens of voyages, creaking and groaning but refusing to die. They were never meant to be beautiful. They were meant to endure. And they did. What astonished observers most was not the pace, but the precision. Each section of a Liberty ship, some weighing as much as 50 tons, fit perfectly into place with sections made miles away. Welding seams met within fractions of an inch. Kaiser's obsession with organization paid off. He built elaborate tracking systems that recorded every part's location, every crew's schedule, every worker's shift. At a time before computers, the entire yard functioned like a living spreadsheet. Reporters who toured the facilities called it a miracle of motion. Newsreels showed time-lapse footage of Liberty ships rising in days. One journalist described it as a steel garden growing overnight. And the workers believed it. They began calling themselves Kaiser's Army. They wore hard hats with the company logo and sang songs about welding for victory. For them, the shipyard wasn't just a job site, it was a battlefield where every spark was a bullet in the fight for freedom. Yet, even as production soared, challenges loomed. Welded ships sometimes cracked in cold waters, a flaw caused by new techniques pushed to their limits. Critics pounced, warning that speed was coming at the expense of safety. But Kaiser, ever the optimist, pushed through. "A few cracks," he said, "are a small price for an ocean of ships." He ordered research into metallurgy, improving the process while never slowing the pace. By now, the numbers spoke for themselves. The Germans had launched 293 U-boats in 1943. The Americans had launched 1,800 Liberty ships. The tide of war was turning, and much of it flowed from the rhythmic hum of Kaiser's shipyards. At night, when the day's last hull slid into the bay, workers often stood in silence, watching the ripples fade under the moonlight. They knew that somewhere across the Atlantic, men were fighting for their lives, and that the ships they built would carry them food, fuel, and hope. It was industrial poetry, written not in words, but in steel and sweat. The Liberty ships were not fast. They were not glamorous. But they were many. And in war, many was enough. By 1944, the Liberty ships had become the silent army of the sea. They were everywhere, long gray convoys stretching across the Atlantic, each ship loaded to the brim with food, tanks, fuel, and ammunition. The men who sailed them were not soldiers, but they faced death just the same. Beneath the waves, German U-boats waited like sharks, hunting in packs. They called the sea their Grey Wolf domain. But even the wolves were starting to starve. Because no matter how many ships they sank, more always came. From California to Maine, from Portland to Richmond, from Baltimore to Mobile, Kaiser's philosophy had spread like wildfire. America's shipyards were working around the clock, producing Liberty ships faster than the Kriegsmarine could destroy them. It was a new kind of warfare, not fought with guns or torpedoes, but with time. Every 4 days, another ship joined the fleet. Every 4 days, the sea filled with one more vessel ready to defy the Atlantic. The Germans called them zombie ships, because no matter how many were sunk, they seemed to rise again. To them, it felt like the Allies had unlocked an industrial sorcery. They didn't realize it was Henry Kaiser's impossible trick: mass production made flesh in steel. The convoys became the arteries of the Allied war effort. Liberty ships carried everything from Sherman tanks to sacks of flour, from locomotives to cigarettes. Some even carried prefabricated airplanes or entire factories, packed in crates to be reassembled overseas. And every voyage came with danger. Men on deck learned to tell the difference between the hiss of wind and the whisper of a torpedo. They watched the sea with eyes that never rested. If the lookout shouted, "Torpedo wake," there were only seconds to react. But by 1944, the game had changed. The convoys were larger, better protected, and coordinated with air cover. The U-boats still struck, but they no longer struck with impunity. Allied destroyers and aircraft hunted them down ruthlessly, guided by sonar and radar. Every time a submarine fired, it risked being spotted and destroyed. The hunters had become the hunted. Behind this transformation lay a quiet, unglamorous truth: logistics had become a weapon. The Liberty ships weren't beautiful, but they were relentless. They ensured that no matter how far American troops advanced, their supplies followed. When Patton's tanks rolled across France, it was Liberty ships that had carried their fuel. When the bombers took off from English airfields, it was Liberty ships that had brought their bombs. In one stunning example, during the build-up to D-Day, more than 3,500 merchant ships, many of them Liberties, ferried millions of tons of material to Britain. Without them, the invasion would have been impossible. General Dwight D. Eisenhower later said that if he had to name the single most important piece of equipment that won the war, it would not be a weapon or a plane, it would be the Liberty ship. The Germans knew it, too. In Berlin, reports from the front painted a picture of futility. U-boat captains wrote in frustration that their victories no longer mattered. One wrote bitterly, "For every ship we sink, 10 take its place." German shipyards couldn't keep pace with replacements for their submarines. Their fuel ran short, their crews exhausted. The industrial machine that had once powered their war was grinding down, and across the ocean, America's machine was only accelerating. In 1943 alone, the Allies launched more tonnage of shipping than Germany could possibly sink. And by 1944, the Atlantic was no longer a graveyard. It was a highway. Convoys arrived on time, their holds bursting with supplies. Even in the face of storm and battle, the flow did not stop. It was as if America had found a rhythm the enemy couldn't disrupt, a heartbeat made of steel hulls and diesel engines. But the success came at a price. Thousands of merchant sailors died in icy waters. Their ships might have been mass-produced, but their courage never was. When a Liberty ship went down, her crew often went with her, the sea claiming both steel and souls. Yet for every ship lost, the yards back home answered with 2 more. The workers in Richmond, Portland, and Bethlehem knew what that meant. When they saw the telegrams of ships sunk, they didn't despair, they worked faster. Henry Kaiser himself became a symbol of this determination. When asked how he could keep up the pace, he said, "We have no time to mourn. The sea demands we build." He wasn't exaggerating. He often toured his shipyards at midnight, watching the night crews at work under arc lights. He knew that every hour saved could mean a convoy arriving intact, or another U-boat sending men to their deaths. The Liberty ships began to appear everywhere: the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, the Pacific. Some carried troops to Normandy, others brought supplies to the jungles of Burma. They were the unsung workhorses of the global war. Even the soldiers on the front lines came to recognize them. They would look up from foxholes and see supplies marked, "From the Liberty Fleet." To them, those words meant survival. By late 1944, the balance of power on the oceans had completely shifted. The German admirals who once bragged about strangling Britain now faced an ocean they could no longer control. The Liberty ships had simply outlasted them. In war, victory often comes from brilliance, a new weapon, a bold maneuver, a stroke of luck. But sometimes, it comes from something far simpler: the ability to endure. The Liberty ships were never fast, never glamorous, never elegant. But they were endless. And in that endlessness lay the death of the U-boat menace, and the rebirth of hope on the open sea. When the war finally ended in 1945, the shipyards that had once thundered day and night fell silent. The sparks faded, the cranes stood still, and the workers, men and women who had built the arteries of victory, drifted back to ordinary life. But the legacy of what they had done lingered everywhere, invisible yet permanent, etched into the bones of modern industry. In Richmond, the last Liberty ship slid into the bay with little fanfare. There were no bands, no speeches, just a handful of workers watching from the dock. They had built hundreds, sometimes 3 or 4 at once, but now the war was over, and so was the urgency that had driven them. Yet even as the tools cooled and the yards emptied, those who had labored there knew they had changed the world. More than 2,700 Liberty ships had been built, an industrial miracle that had once seemed impossible. They carried 2/3 of all the cargo that crossed the Atlantic, moved millions of troops, and delivered the raw materials of victory. Many were battered, patched, or retired within a few years, but a few kept sailing for decades after the guns fell silent. Their rusting hulls became monuments to a time when speed had meant survival. For the German admirals who studied the war afterward, the Liberty ship became a haunting symbol. They realized that the Allied victory at sea hadn't come from a single battle or a superior fleet, it had come from the quiet, unstoppable rhythm of production. One German naval officer wrote in his post-war report, "They outbuilt our torpedoes. We could sink, but they could replace." It was the most grudging form of respect, admiration for the enemy's machine. For Henry Kaiser, the "miracle man" of the home front, the war was both a triumph and a beginning. He had taken on the U.S. Navy's skepticism and proved them wrong. His "impossible trick," building a ship every 4 days, had not only changed shipbuilding but redefined how America thought about industry. Factories that once took years to complete projects now measured production in hours. The lessons learned in his shipyards rippled across post-war America. The health clinics Kaiser created for his workers evolved into Kaiser Permanente, one of the first and most successful healthcare systems in the world. His experiment with prefabrication influenced housing, automobiles, and even the space program decades later. In many ways, the blue-collar revolution that defined the mid-20th century began not in Detroit or Pittsburgh, but on the muddy shores of Richmond, California, under the glow of welding torches. To the people who had worked there, the war years felt like a blur, a time when the impossible became routine. Women remembered welding at midnight with babies asleep in the nursery nearby. Men recalled the hum of the cranes and the sight of ships sliding into the bay one after another like dominoes. For many, it had been their first time working alongside people of different races or backgrounds. The shipyards broke barriers before the country did. A worker named Louise Bianchi later said, "We didn't think about it at the time. We just worked. We were too busy making history to realize it." Her words captured the essence of Kaiser's world, ordinary people doing extraordinary things, one weld, one plate, one ship at a time. Even decades later, when historians looked back on the war, they often focused on the big moments: D-Day, Midway, the fall of Berlin. But beneath all those battles ran a constant stream of motion, a river of steel that made everything else possible. Without the Liberty ships, there would have been no Normandy, no Patton racing across Europe, no Allied airfield supplied with fuel. They were the quiet heroes of logistics, the lifeline of democracy. One Liberty ship, the Jeremiah O'Brien, still sails today, restored and preserved in San Francisco. Her decks creak with age, her hull patched and worn, but when her engines rumble to life, they carry an echo of that age, the sound of 1940s America at full stride. Visitors walk her decks, see the cramped quarters, and hear the stories of the men who sailed her. It's hard to believe that thousands more ships like her once crowded the seas, built by hands that never doubted their purpose. Henry Kaiser himself never saw his influence fade. After the war, he built cars, airplanes, even concrete dams. The man who had once been called a dreamer became a legend of American enterprise. When asked how he accomplished so much, he gave the same answer he had during the war: "Don't fight the problem, build the solution." And that was what the Liberty ships had been, the solution. To a world sinking under the weight of war, they were lifeboats. To an America untested in global conflict, they were proof that willpower could be engineered. In the end, the story of the Liberty ships was not just about production. It was about people, millions of them, who refused to believe that something couldn't be done. They worked without sleep, without pause, with faith that their effort would make a difference. And it did. The ships they built didn't just cross oceans. They crossed the line between despair and victory. Even now, when rusted hulls lie forgotten on distant shores, the ghosts of those welders, riveters, and dreamers remain. They remind us that history is not only written by generals or fought by soldiers. Sometimes, it's built, welded together in the dark, under sparks and sweat, by people who dared to believe that time itself could be beaten. And for a brief, miraculous moment in history, they did.